Good evening, everyone. My name is John Taves, and I'm the event coordinator at McNally Robinson Booksellers in Winnipeg, Manitoba. We're broadcasting tonight from Treaty 1 territory, the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. I'd like to offer my sincere thanks to Goose Lane for not only publishing two of the books that we're discussing this evening, but also helping to bring this evening together. So many thanks to Jeff and everybody on the team there. We are here tonight specifically to celebrate the publication of Patricia Robertson's new collection of short stories, Hour of the Crab. And we're joined by two very special guests. Over the course of the evening, during the conversation, we'll be building up to an opportunity for all of you to ask questions. So you'll notice that there's a Q&A box right at the bottom of your screen. Please feel free to enter questions into that box as they occur to you over the course of the evening. Rest assured you won't interrupt the conversation at all. And then when the natural conversation between our three guests has come to a close, I'll then reappear and start asking some of your questions. There's also a chat, so feel free to be as effusive as you'd like over there. All positive things, please. I'll be moderating that. And we're just delighted that you're joining us right now, live in Zoom, watching on YouTube, either now or in the future. You're in for a real treat this evening. So first, I'd like to introduce our guest of honor this evening. Born in the UK, Patricia Robertson grew up in British Columbia and received her MA in creative writing from Boston University. Her first collection of short stories, City of Orphans, was shortlisted for the Ethel Wilson Fiction Prize, while her second collection, The Goldfish Dancer, was hailed by the National Post as a work of insight and mastery. She was awarded the Aesthetica International Prize for Poetry in 2018, which is one of my favorite prize names. Robertson's fiction and essays have appeared in Best Canadian Stories and Best Canadian Essays and have been shortlisted for the Journey Prize, the CBC Literary Awards, the Pushcart Prize, and the National Magazine Awards. She has served as writer-in-residence at libraries and universities across Canada. Winnipeg is now lucky to be able to call her a resident in general. Her new collection of short fiction, Hour of the Crab, is a work of insight and mastery, urgent, evocative, and immersed in issues of our times. Because everyone loves enthusiastic adjectives, here are a few more. David Hubert has called this collection exhilarating and poised, a mythos of modern times. And there are two comments from both Joan Thomas and Wayne Grady I'd like to bring up very quickly to start. Joan Thomas says the stories in this sure-footed collection take us deeper into the world and invite us to see outside our usual framing of things in times when our literary options might seem to be diversion or despair. Robertson offers a third way to look steadily and respond humanely. And Grady says that these stories show our habitual ways of confronting change are no longer working. Her stories realign what we think we know about the world. They are that good. So please, without further ado, here to read from her collection and move on to a discussion of climate in fiction, please give a virtual welcome to Patricia Robertson.
Thank you very much for that glowing introduction, John. I'm delighted to be here, delighted to be sharing this book with you. And I'm going to begin by reading actually from the title story. And I think all you need to know at the beginning, I'm going to read the opening scene and then a couple of other short scenes from near the beginning of the story. I think all you need to know is that our central character, Kate, is a young woman, early 30s, Canadian, and she's on holiday in southern Spain with her husband, Gavin. And we begin on a morning shortly after their arrival. Kate, walking along the beach, found the body. She was kicking pebbles into the little frothy waves and pretending. Each stone bore away a burden. Unswept winter grit on our front steps. Stupid argument with Vikram over the specs for that client. Missing Diane's wedding and my mother saying, "You never think of..." The last pebble thunked against something sodden. There in the shallows, a few strides ahead, some tangle of something, washed in by the tide probably. Sunlight glittered, darkening her vision. A larger wave flung the tangle closer, wrapped round a dead fish. Not a fish. A human foot, bloated, grey-white. Jeans plastered to thin legs. Now an arm, swollen, wound in seaweed. She stopped on a caught breath, watching without hope for tiny movement. Only the waves moved, rocking, rocking. Hand over her mouth, she bent forward. The body was slack, without tension. T-shirt hold and rotting. Narrow shoulders, flat chest. Not a child, but not quite an adult either. The frilled edges of a cut on the left calf gaped. Along the Avenida, the first of the cafes were clattering their metal fronts open. Shakily, she looked up and down the beach. No one, except far off near the rocks, holding a scoop net, an elderly fisherman who would not know English. The head lolled toward her, a face that was not a face, lips eaten away, teeth and nose coated with foam. She knelt, eyes averted, peeled the pockets apart. No ID, no cell phone, nothing. The zip of the jeans, salt-crusted, gave suddenly on a fat, bleached penis. Male, she could report, if that was what she was going to do. He must have been in the water for days. On the more intact foot was a tattoo of some sort, a stick figure. Was that it? With a triangle on either side. She puzzled over it. Smuggling? Drugs? Or nothing, just some design he'd liked. But if she went to the police, she'd heard the stories, she wasn't naive. A tiny crab scuttered from the right ear, disappeared into sand. She'd go back to the pension instead, wake Gavin, keep her mouth shut. Let someone else find him. It wouldn't take long. Gavin, his medical residency a year behind him, now working nights in emergency, deserved a break. She couldn't do a thing for the drowned boy, but she could protect her husband. Hadn't that been the reason for coming here? To leave the weight of duty and a just-ended Canadian winter behind? When she reached the shop where she and Gavin had bought ice creams the evening before, something stopped and turned her. He was someone's son, someone's brother or lover. Somewhere people were worrying about him. Though when she walked back, the row of cars in front of the commissariat with their sword and axe symbol made her hesitate. Yes, we find on beach all the time, the duty officer in his rumpled shirt said, his hands splayed out. She'd finally managed to get herself inside, where he interrupted her flailing Spanish. We pick up and make report. The body, it goes to El Deposito de Cadáveres. All the time? They found bodies on the beach all the time? He is migrant, illegal migrant. The officer was exasperated, half contemptuous. They come in boats, too many people from over there. The hand flung out again. From Africa, from Marruecos, Tunis. Then engine breaks. They have no food, no water. Then a storm comes. He pushed angrily at a stack of papers. Not drugs then, but desperation or determination or reckless desire. We pick up and make report. His statement wasn't callous, but exact. It wasn't the officer's fault the boy had come, or anyone's. In an hour or two, there'd be no evidence the body had ever been there. Other people would spread out beach towels, lay their own living bodies down on the sparkling sand. She was hanging up the sundress in the darkened room, the shutters pulled to, when the boy surfaced. He sat up suddenly and smiled at her, his white teeth alarming. I am sorry I fall asleep. It was long to swim here. He looked past her at something, perhaps the ocean. Was that what he saw? After boat sinks, I have to try, no? His small, dry laugh sounded as if he were choking. He stood, his body narrow and bony under the wet shirt, the ratty jeans. You are from America? His face, with its fine, flared nose and a dimple that came and went, was intact, smooth, beautiful. She glanced away for a moment, breaking eye contact, reassuring herself with the solidity of shutters, night table, bed. The hanger with the sundress bit into her fingers. Or England, maybe. Me, I go to Germany. A brother of a friend will help. He laughed his small, dry laugh again. You come to play. I come to find life. A living? Was that what he meant? To make a living? No, a life. He jerked his head in what might have been the direction of Africa. Over there is nothing, nothing walking to meet you. In the afternoon, over a late Spanish lunch, she leafed through the local English language newspaper. Properties for sale, beachfront flats, expat businesses, the arrest of a fish and chip shop owner for speeding, water restrictions because of the drought. Nothing about drowned migrants. Oh, yes, one small paragraph near the back. A boatload of refugees, the third this week. The engine had broken down in rough seas. They drifted for days. 39 out of 83 had been rescued. The dead included 7 children under 4, their bodies thrown overboard by their parents. Where are my babies? One mother kept asking the Red Cross workers. Had he been on that boat? Somewhere in the continent beyond, people waited for news, waited to hear if he'd arrived safely, if he'd met up with others, if he'd found work. When she looked up, the boy was sitting there, leaning forward on his elbows, watching her as if she were deciding his fate. Stop it, she wanted to tell him. Stop following me. It's your own fault. You chose to come.
Thank you so much, Patricia. I think all you folks out there listening will understand exactly what that comment meant earlier about just the mythic qualities of Patricia's writing. It's a really fabulous collection. I'd now like to introduce our 2 special guests for the evening, and it's such an immense privilege to be in very esteemed company. Catherine Bush is the author of 5 novels, including Blaze Island, a Globe and Mail Best Book, and The Rules of Engagement, a New York Times Notable Book, and a Globe and Mail and LA Times Best Book of the Year. Her books have been shortlisted for the Trillium and City of Toronto Book Awards in Canada. She was a 2019 Fiction Meets Science Fellow at the HWK in Germany and has written and spoken internationally about responding to the climate crisis through fiction. She is the coordinator of the University of Guelph Creative Writing MFA located in Toronto and can be found online at catherinebush.com. Her new novel, Blaze Island, asks how far a parent will go to create a safe world for a child and how that child will imagine a future. In the words of Lisa Moore, Bush's prose is a lightning storm in the dark of the climate crisis, gothic, forceful, and beautifully intimate. Our second guest, whose phantasmagorical forthcoming book I am now holding up in my hands, is Sharon English, a writer and teacher whose work emerges from a deep interest in how place and placelessness shapes us, and how writing matters in a time of ecological and cultural unraveling. She's the author of 2 story collections, Uncomfortably Numb and Zero Gravity, which was longlisted for the Giller Prize. Her writing has also been published by Best Canadian Stories, Canadian Notes and Queries, and the Dark Mountain Project in the UK. At the time of Zero Gravity's publication, Alex Good and Stephen Beattie referred to Sharon as one of our sharpest talents, wedding precision of language to a remarkable moral and imaginative range. Her novel, Night in the World, is forthcoming in 2022 from Freehand Books, taken from a description on her website, which you can correct immediately. She describes it in a nutshell as focusing on ecological catastrophe and midlife crisis, Toronto Island, Rice Lake and the Humber River, moths and master's thesis studies, drugs and marriage, fracking, activism and falling in love, coming home to oneself, one's family, and the beauty and soulfulness of Earth in an age of unraveling. So I'd just like to ask all you fine folks a very quick question before I disappear, returning for the public Q&A. So responding first yourself, Patricia, and then perhaps yourself, Catherine, and then Sharon. I'd like you to address in each case where the story idea came from for each of your books, and how you see the connection between the story that you've written and the climate crisis itself, or how the story fits into the genre of climate fiction. I'd also encourage nobody to use the abbreviation CLIFLY, lest Patricia actually reach in a rage out of the screen. So thank you all.
Well, where the story idea came from. I lived in Spain for 3 years in the 1970s and became very attached to that country, and continue to follow events there. And so it's not been hard to watch the people from the global south heading north to, the golden world of Europe through Africa. And I read many stories about migrants landing on the beaches of Spain, sometimes arrested, sometimes they manage to escape into various kinds of hidden camps. And of course, many of them don't make it. And I read one story, and this is while I was doing my research, it wasn't the impetus for the story, but about a teacher and his wife out walking one day, and they found 27 corpses on the beach, all young men. And they were so horrified, they decided they had to find where these young men came from if they could, just so they could return the bodies and let the families know what had happened. And they managed, in fact, to trace them, all of them, to a small Moroccan village. And in response, they ended up setting up an NGO they decided if they helped the village, then the men wouldn't be making these terribly dangerous journeys. And so they helped build a school in the village, they bought goats, and as a result, no more young men left that particular village. I wish that were the answer for all communities who are losing so many of their young to the Mediterranean, and to Fortress Europe refusing to let them in and deporting them. So that was the impetus for the story, and it came to haunt me, the whole passage across the Mediterranean, what happened to the young, and how Kate, who is pretty naive Canadian, is confronted with this, what I think is one of the central issues of our time. And it's very connected to the climate crisis, because the climate crisis, in fact, is what is driving much of the migration. If it's not at drought, it is civil war brought about by fighting over resources. There's less and less work. The pandemic has made things, of course, much worse. Fishing communities are running out of fish because the EU and other bodies are doing massive dragging operations, so there's no fish for local communities. It is just a catalog of disasters for these people, and that's why they're coming. And so it's important to me to not use the shorthand that the media likes of climate change or the climate crisis, because it extends much further than the climate. It's affecting all of us, and it's affecting everything, every being on the planet.
Thanks, Patricia. And it's just such a thrill to be here, helping you celebrate the launch of The Crab. And it's such a powerful opening story, powerful opening to a riveting entire collection. And I totally agree that I will use the term the climate crisis, but it is certainly part of a much larger phenomenon, as you've so beautifully described. If I'm thinking about it as a writer, and thinking about it in the context of Blaze Island, my most recent novel, I think of it as an aspect of the new realism that one can't and shouldn't ignore in life or in fiction. The biospheric loss, the climate emergency, Because if you're ignoring it in fiction, it's enacting a kind of artistic denialism. That doesn't mean that it has to be front and center all the time. I mean, I think of your story, Fire Breathing, and the fires, the forest fires, they're so powerful, and they're an element of climate change, but that's a kind of resonating undernote. Or I think of the tinnitus of melting ice that a character experiences in Martha Bailey's The Search for Heinrich Schlogel, and indigenous dystopias where the climate emergency may not be central, but it's part of the dystopic background, like in Wabgishig Rice, Moon of the Crusted Snow. But in Blaze Island, I very much wanted to put the climate crisis front and center narratively. I saw it as a challenge to try and figure out how I could tell a climate-centered story. I'm also very interested in bringing science into relationship with literature. And so making scientific languages and other world languages rub up against each other. So in Blaze Island, a climate scientist is at the heart of the story, though the novel is narrated by the climate scientist's daughter and another young man. And I was also really drawn to the ethical issues of climate engineering. Should we go further in the direction of researching or even doing field experiments with tech hacks? So further intervene in the atmospheric system out of desperation, as is the predicament of my climate scientist. I just think I'm certainly not advocating for it, but it seemed a really rich ethical terrain. And Elizabeth Kolbert, the New Yorker science writer who's done a lot of work on climate change, her new book, I think it's In the White Sky, I'm going to get the title wrong, addresses this form of solar radiation management specifically. But I was also really interested in the emotions that are aroused by ecological loss and climate catastrophe, anger, fear. How does one parent from these positions, and what kind of intergenerational conflicts arise because of them? So those were some of the impetuses for Flora's Blaze Island, and also a really deep desire to evoke a world beyond the human, to decenter the human story. And for me, that also feels really real on the page now, to have a world in which the human story is immersed within the stories of other life forms on this planet.
Hi, wow, congratulations, Patricia. And I'm just kind of mesmerized listening to both of you speak. It's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you. I was reminded in thinking about this event of some of the words by Amitav Ghosh, the novelist and author of a book called Climate Change and the Unthinkable. And he spoke in a lecture that I went to actually with Catherine a couple of years ago here at University of Toronto, where I am right now. He spoke about how climate change is inseparable from geopolitics, from empire, and from what he called ideologies of extermination. And I think that intersects really well with your story, Patricia, and the kinds of complexities that story is evoking, that intersection of geopolitics, climate. He spoke about how climate change is sort of pushing centuries-old ideologies and patterns to the surface and kind of putting them in our face. So how it might be a relatively new phenomenon in our lives, but the context is centuries old in the making. And yeah, like you, like both of you, I find, well, cli-fi as a term, kind of a marketing, reductive term for marketing purposes, and most fiction that we've had up until recently that is kind of falls under the banner of cli-fi is fairly apocalyptic or post-apocalyptic, concerned with surviving catastrophe, but not so much how we might be challenged to change profoundly because of these crises culturally in a much deeper way. So for myself in my novel, I was really interested in kind of the question of relationship that climate change and other Earth systems crises like species extinction point to the question of what our relationship is with the natural world, our problematic relationship with the natural world and each other. And it's like a crisis of relationship. So I was, for me, it was really important. My book is called Night in the World, and it was really important to write a story that was where somehow the personal and this rather abstract thing, ecological crisis, would intersect in a meaningful way. I was really interested in a story that would be about bearing witness to what's happening in the world, to what it means to come home or questions of home, what it means to make home in an unstable world, what is the cost of the homes that we've might we make our homes differently. I think, yeah, coming home has been it was really important for me to think about how do we bridge this great alienation that we've kind of landed ourselves in as modern human beings, at least in the West, of feeling so isolated from the natural world. And what alters when we admit our mistakes and open up to the possibility of a kind of kinship-based relationship to the world, to the non-human others. Yeah, I think I had the same kinds of questions as both of you, and Catherine, what you were saying about kind of giving agency to the non-human and making the non-human more central in my writing was really important to me as well, sort of decentering the human as the focal point or the only focal point of the story, kind of like turning up the volume on the natural world and what it's trying to say, so to speak. And I don't mean that in a woo-woo way, as it might sound. I mean really listening to what the non-human is telling us about how to live and how we need to change.
Patricia, I'd love to ask you a question.
Yes.
And I've been thinking about this in relation to writing the current crisis, and it's a question of tone. And it strikes me reading your collection, there's such tonal variety and different modes of storytelling employed. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about your approach to different storytelling modes as being an aspect of responding to the current crisis that you want to represent on the page?
That's a great question. I think I've been quite involved with as Sharon has, with the UK Stark Mountain Project, which began in 2009 with two men who called themselves disillusioned environmentalists, and they were also both writers. And they felt that the stories we were telling ourselves were no longer useful, were no longer valid. And they were really questioning not just fiction, but the culture in general. And they went on to involve other people, to publish biannual anthologies, which are still continuing. They had a series of festivals. And I think they've had a real impact on thinking about story and literature, especially in the UK, but it has spread elsewhere. And it had become, I was so relieved to find them, because starting around the turn of the millennium, I was in despair about what I was reading in fiction. I felt it was absolutely ignoring, apart from the kinds of dystopias, really genre fiction, speculative fiction, sci-fi, totally engaged with it. Literary fiction, it was like nothing was happening. Like life was just going on as normal. I mean, there may have been the odd exception, but in general, and I found I couldn't write it anymore. And in fact, I ended up writing a juvenile speculative fiction novel, which I self-published, just because it seemed to me, well, partly the story, the idea, the characters came, but they also seemed to me so much truer to what was happening. And with fantasy fiction, you know, the stakes are so high. Often, you know, life and death, the entire planet's going to vanish, right? And in my story, it was 2 children and a dog who saved the day. I'm happy to tell you that they did, in fact, save the planet. So that was very cathartic to write. It was it was fun to write in a lot of ways. And then I discovered Dark Mountain, and I thought, oh my God, I'm not alone and I'm not crazy. And it really provided a lifeline when I badly needed it. And I came partly through Dark Mountain's influence to see how important it was to go back to archetypal stories, to mythology, to the grounds of our stories that I think came out of the land originally, when we were all Indigenous, when we were all Aboriginal. You know, we told stories about where we lived, which we have almost entirely lost. And we've destroyed the cultures that are still doing it, or we're in, you know, in the process of doing it. I'm happy to say that I managed to include several dogs in my story collection. One of my friends said, "Not another dog." And a dog has the last word, which I thought was really quite important, that I knew that story had to be at the end, because the dog's thought at the end of the story kind of ends the collection where I wanted it. The dog is very non-judgmental the way animals are, right? The dog doesn't judge what the humans are doing, but the dog sees himself as a protector of the child in the story. And yeah, I think the tonal range allowed me not to just stay in, oh my God, everything's so dark and despairing, but to look at many different ways of responding, and to move in and out of realism. In fact, I like to think of my fiction as sort of heightened realism, because it certainly has a ground, as a foot very firmly in the ground of the real. I need that. I'm not interested in being just off on distant planets. But to me, we have to include other dimensions of reality, because they're there. Because it's, to me, it doesn't, if we're not recognizing those other dimensions, we're missing something authentic about the world, and not just the human world, but the world of being.
Yeah, that's so interesting.
So thank you for that question.
I mean, I've often thought of my own work as being a kind of elastic realism. And, you know, in Blaze Island, certainly, which is inspired by Shakespeare's play The Tempest and set on a fictional version of Fogo Island off the coast of Newfoundland, there's an amplification that takes place because of the tempest elements, and it starts in a huge hurricane. But I mean, people have asked me about the science and the exploration of solar radiation management. And while, you know, the actual on the ground experiment is somewhat fictionalized, the actual science is not. And the science itself engages, I mean, the desire for a science that will fix our, you know, biospheric problems is itself a kind of magical thinking, one can say. Yes. And yet at this, you know, the same time, I was really conscious writing the novel that while I wanted to address weather unpredictability and changing atmospheric conditions and change as it's experienced by the characters in all sorts of ways, I really didn't want to hit a dystopic note. And I I wanted there to be that sort of sensual storytelling pleasure for readers, which I associate with, you know, fairy tales or old forms of tales, which certainly comes through in your collection, and there to be that heightened tone and that kind of seduction. And then I've been slightly thrown when readers keep saying, I enjoyed your novel. And I'm like, wait, it's a novel about climate science. But I did also want that seductive element to be there. Sharon, what are your thoughts?
If I can just jump in, because I have a question for both, or a comment for both of you, that yes, that seductive and storytelling, absolutely. I mean, that has to be, you know, we're not talking about didactic fiction, right? We're talking about real people who are very real to us and hopefully will become real to the readers involved in these many different challenges of now or the very near future. But what I loved about your novel, Catherine, and I'm about halfway through, is the land. The presence of the land is such a powerful character. And I wanted to comment on Sharon's story about ginseng, Sharon, which features this plant, which has such a presence as well in the story. And I wondered if you could both talk about that kind of, which I find so powerful, where we're allowing the land and its beings to speak. And just as an aside, we're now learning how trees communicate. There's all this new science about trees almost literally talking to each other and to insects and other plants. It's fascinating what we're learning. They're alive, they're conscious, they're sentient. And I think that's there in your work, if you'd both like to comment on that.
Yeah, thanks for asking, Patricia. So I think in wanting to, I think it's about kind of two things. Or for me, writing, it's bearing witness to the ugly, the awful, the terrifying, the violent that's happening in our world, but also you spoke of enlarging the sense of enlarging the world of being and bringing that into fiction. Yeah, the story that you referenced about ginseng is called El Dorado. That was a story I wrote, I don't know, maybe a decade ago, about a relationship to a plant, or a character's relationship to a plant. And I wanted the plant to be kind of a central character in the story, even though the story is about these two human beings. It's really about this question that I raised earlier, the question of relationship, is what is kind of right relationship to the plant world or the plant people, and what are the consequences? What are the consequences of an exploitive relationship versus a relationship based on maybe mutual recognition of the gift of ginseng to human beings and what we can give in return. So yeah, in my novel, I tried to enlarge the world of being by, there's three different stories, three different characters in the novel, and one of them is someone studying moths as a budding biologist. And I very much, that narrative is about listening or learning to listen to what these creatures, to who these creatures are, and learning to kind of surrender to the possibility that we don't have all the answers, and we have something to learn from the natural world, from its stories, so to speak, from the stories of the land, or the creatures of the land.
Yeah.
I'd just like to echo Sharon's comment about listening and how important that was to my writing practice. While writing Blaze Island, I mean, I went to Fogo Island as a visitor over the course of 8 years, and I was listening to the stories that people on the island were telling me, and both about how they relate to the lands, plants, fish, animals, wind, the world there was described to me as a place where wind decides everything. And I taught myself, I'm no expert, but to listen to the wind in ways I never had before, and to listen to when it changed direction, which is certainly an awareness that stayed with me. But, it's a much deeper practice, that kind of land listening and awareness of relationship, which Sharon has spoken of so beautifully, and the importance of trying to bring that wider network of kinship into animated life in fiction seems to me a really interesting challenge as a writer now, how to make that lively on the page. And it's not necessarily new, as Patricia, you've said. I mean, we draw on old forms of storytelling too, to do this. Yeah.
You make me think of the British fairy tales that I was raised on, where, of course you had talking animals and trees, and it was perfectly, as a child, you totally accept that world. But we lose touch when I say we, I really mean the industrialized world. I mean, and we live among Indigenous people who are working hard to listen, to maintain those connections in the face of a cultured society that is indifferent by and large, if not actively hostile. And I like you, Catherine, on Fogo Island, I spent 20 years living in the Yukon, and learned some of the most profound lessons of my life there, not contained in books, which I used to think held all the answers. The land, the landscape, the river, just walking beside the river, the way the Indigenous people, and I had opportunities to work closely with a number of elders and younger people, and the stories they told me. It was haunting in a lot of ways, because I realized how much I felt such sadness about how much we had lost or had not grown up with in the first place. And I feel the pandemic is calling us back. I really feel this can be an opportunity to say, you know what, we need to be listening to different voices, and we haven't done all that well, just, relying on humans and thinking we're this clever ape, right, who can destroy the world if we want through geoengineering now. And well, that just hasn't gone too well. So maybe, I think the dogs probably have the answers, along with the trees. Yes. Maybe John had better jump in before I get any sillier.
Yes, I've come as an interloper, but come to also deliver some questions from your audience. And there's one actually that was asked by somebody just a little while ago that builds on what you were discussing a little bit too. Paul Kingsnorth, who is one of the writers you were referring to when it came to the founders of the Dark Mountain Project, has lamented the seeming inability of modern literature to fully engage with the natural world, to tell a story in which nature is a fully active character. And the person who asked that question was hoping that you might address that issue and just kind of discuss whether Kingsnorth is correct. And if so, how do you feel authors can give nature their due?
Patricia, do you want to start? I mean, I've got things to say, but I'll give you say.
I was thinking actually about something Catherine said about listening, and that wonderful quote you were given on by the people you met. The wind decides everything. Did I get that right? Wow, and it's there in the novel. I mean, Miranda learning to read the wind, and it's wonderful. It reminds me of the Yukon, a very different landscape, but in that relationship reminds me. And I think we have a lot of listening to do. I really do. And you work with Indigenous people. They don't talk. They don't tell you. They're very lean with their words, very measured, and how they teach is through showing you. So there's a lot of paying attention and listening to other voices beside human ones. And I think we have a lot of unlearning to do, or certainly I feel that about myself anyway.
I think that's a beautiful way of putting it, that we need to unlearn things. And I totally agree with everything you've said. I would just want to add that there there are works, even within the Anglo-European tradition, that I think of as deeply biophilic novels. And there's certainly, as you've so beautifully acknowledged, indigenous traditions in North America, indigenous traditions of writing and storytelling, and you know, the European tradition of fairy tales, which are very land rooted. But you know, their novels, there's a strange early 20th century French novel called Colline by an author named Jean Giono. And it's just, everything is so intensely alive in that novel. Or if you go back and read Melville, or certainly Barbara Gowdy's The White Bone is another, you know, go-to place for me in terms of her extraordinary embodiment of elephants. And I feel like, you know, there are works there when we can create alternate libraries of works in which the world is fully alive. And yeah, I just think there are a lot of precursors. We just need to acknowledge them and speak to them and keep those lineages, all those multiple lineages alive.
Yeah, I can just add that I think King's North is mostly right, but not totally right. And as Catherine just said, I was thinking of Melville immediately and other works as well. And I think that it's something that's going to change, and it changes, but it will change as we change our lives. And I don't. Like when I was writing my book, one of the things that I was doing, and really what the book emerged from, was walking around in Toronto a lot. So the book is set in the city, and that was very important to me, to set it in the city. It's not about nature over there, it's about right here under your feet. But I did a lot of walking and exploring and really trying to listen and get to know this place and feel what it's like to be here, walking by rivers, visiting Toronto Island, which is kind of a key character in the book. And I think that as writers and thinkers change, as we change our practices, so to speak, as we change our way of living, like that was for me a real significant conscious change, was to be outside, kind of taking my story from out there, and not just holed up in my study. And I think King's North is an example of somebody who's done that as a writer who's tried to live sort of spending a lot of time with the land. But I think that is going to change if we change. Yeah.
I just want to call attention to Sharon has this amazing piece that was on the Dark Mountain site recently. It's an essay, I guess, but it's set in the Humber River Valley in Toronto. So it's an urban ravine. It's about an encounter that takes place there during pandemic time. And so it does all the things that you're just describing about rewilding an urban environment and allowing yourself to be transformed.
Thank you. Yeah, that's based on it. That's a nonfiction piece. So I'll just say that's based on what really happened. Things that happen when you walk around.
I wanted to add to what both of you have been saying, that, you know, the natural world, and I don't really like that term because we're part of it, and again, it's this division and duality, but it's all around us, right? We even living in the cities, and I live in a city, I live in Winnipeg, but you know, I have birds coming to the feeders. I watch the squirrel trying to get the suet from the birds. There's lots to pay attention to, I think, even in a city, and to create relationships with. I more and more feel, I think you both mentioned the idea of kinship, that creating those, becoming more and more aware of those connections and how essential they are to feed us, especially perhaps at this time. And I think, in fact, the pandemic, I see it around me, has forced people outside. Winnipeg has had a more active winter scene than I've seen before. It's been amazing watching people, build snow forts on the river, and now apparently you can't buy a bike anymore in the city because everybody wants to be out on their bike. Now that all of a sudden we've got an early spring here. It was 11 degrees today, climate crisis. But on the other hand, let's get out there and honor and be recognize that we are mammals, we are animals, we are part of this world, even as we live in cities.
So we've received, I'd say, 3 more questions that we'll address this evening before we wind things up. One is specifically for you, Patricia, and I believe the other 2 could be opened up to all participants. Before I embark on that, I should point out that somebody has very kindly linked to Sharon's piece in the chat. So if you are interested in reading that article, the link is available. So Patricia, is the other dimension that you spoke of earlier connected to your practice of Sufism in any way?
I suppose I feel like I've been on a spiritual search for a long time. I mean, I was raised as a Christian and then chucked it over, of course, when I was 16 and decided I was an atheist. And based on the hypocrisy of the people I saw around me, which was extremely judgmental, but that's what you're like when you're 16. And at some point, I think if you are working authentically as an artist, I don't see how you can avoid that search. Interestingly, Paul Kingsnorth, who came from, as far as I know, quite an agnostic background, has and was initially very uncomfortable talking about, because he saw himself as an intellectual freed from those kinds of superstitions. But he recently converted to Eastern Orthodox Christianity. I was quite astonished to read about it. And he lives on the land in Ireland, as Sharon mentioned, and deliberately chose that lifestyle. So I don't think you can turn away from those kinds of questions. I mean, everybody answers them in their own way, but for me, it was important to find a living mystical practice, which is what Sufism is. It's no longer very present in Christianity, and it's there in Judaism, but it was Sufism that found me, I suppose, as much as I found it. And I have a couple of amazing teachers who are American but lived for years in the Middle East and are translators of Rumi and other really important writers from the Sufi world.
Thank you, Patricia. I'm now going to dangerously ask you to all act as futurists, as we received a question. How pessimistic or optimistic are you that significant changes will be made in this decade to address climate change? Naturally loaded question that anybody can jump in and respond to.
Ooh. I don't think we're moving fast enough. I think everybody knows that. I don't hold out much hope for the big COP26 meeting that's being held in November of this year in Glasgow, because none of the other conferences have, governments make commitments and then fail to carry them out because no doubt they're heavily lobbied by their funders. My optimism lies with the young, with Greta Thunberg and her movement with Extinction Rebellion, which started in the UK and has spread. It will definitely come from the grassroots. Power does not give up without a fight. And as Shelley said, we are many, they are few. So on my good days, I think, move over will somehow. But on the other hand, and I want Catherine and Sharon to have a chance to respond. There is movement. There is movement with the stranded assets now of fossil fuel companies. They're seeing the writing on the wall. They're going down fighting using all the tactics of big tobacco. But there's change is definitely happening. And in some ways, even compared to 5 years ago, it's surprising what movement it's been. And it's in part thanks to those grassroots movements. Thunberg and her, the many thousands, tens of thousands of students and young people around the world who have echoed her, amplified her call for us to change, to behave like adults, as she says.
I would just want to speak to, whatever happens, and in a way we can only imagine a future based on the past. I mean, we can never see what kind of abrupt ruptures or unpredictabilities are going to occur, witness the pandemic. But I really believe we have to keep, an element of like a love for the natural world and this broad sense of kinship alive. And I don't want my literature, my fiction to be programmatic. That sounds like a programmatic statement, but I really search for that transformative energy and the place of imagination and wonder and animism. And I think those energies can themselves be self-perpetuating and spreading. And I like to believe that the pandemic experience being pushed up against extremity, humans have responded in extraordinary ways. So, I just, I want more wonder and more imagination and possibility, and a lot of the hard work of navigating kinship and re-seeing the world as well.
Wow, I just want to say yes to that. Can we just end on that note? That was fantastic. I don't have much to add. I think that there's a profound collective sense that the status quo is not serving us. It's not serving the planet. It's not going to serve the future beings, the children. I think there's a great collective sense of anxiety and grief around ecological unraveling. And I feel like at the same time, there is an incredible yearning for finding a deeper meaning in these crises that we're experiencing, and that the deeper meaning is there. We need to have much more conversation and dialogue and books that prompt us in that direction. That I think there's the possibility of tremendous change for the better if we can have those conversations. And it's not really about fixing the problems we have, but rather changing ourselves, changing our minds, our hearts, and really looking at our values and living differently from that place. And I think there is a question, and it came up in the earlier, a question about Sufism, about our relationship to the sacred. What is the sacred for us? Can home be a sacred thing if we want to just even limit it to that? And then how do we serve that?
Well, I may have spoken out of turn when I mentioned 3 questions, because I did just notice that we are at the hour right now, and that does seem like a positive note to wind it down on. So I was wondering if any of you had any closing comments you'd like to make, then I can come in with the drier housekeeping notes at the end of this wonderful evening.
I just want to say thank you. Thank you it's such a privilege and a joy, and actually fills me with, wonder and energy to listen to Patricia and Sharon. And I love Patricia's stories, and I can't wait for Sharon's novel. And I just wanted to thank John and McNally Robinson and Goose Lane for all the work everyone's done putting together this wonderful evening.
I would just, yes, Catherine said it all already, but thank you so much, John, for your wonderful hosting as usual, and to Goose Lane and McNally Robinson. And thank you, Catherine and Sharon, who came in sort of as a last minute guest. I'm so happy that you were able to join us. And it's wonderful to feel so much less alone when I think how alone I felt, say 15 years ago with these questions. and now I don't. And I think this conversation tonight this conversation gives me hope. It gives me, I think our conversations are changing, and that means our stories will change as well, the kinds of stories we tell. And that's so important, because they're alive, and they're real, and they matter. And thank you to everyone who came tonight and participated in yet another Zoom event. So it's been a real joy. Thank you.
Yes, I'll just echo that. Thank you, participants, and for the questions, the excellent questions, and the opportunity to be here and have these conversations. I too used to feel very isolated in thinking about these questions a decade, 15 years ago, and things are changing. And it's wonderful to be here tonight. So thank you.
I'm going to continue the gratitude momentarily by reiterating essentially what everybody else has said. Thank you, everybody else here in the chat, watching on YouTube, for your attention and your warm contributions. I'll remind you all to look out for Night in the World, forthcoming in spring of 2022 from Freehand Books. That's from Sharon English. Blaze Island is out now from Goose Lane Editions by Catherine Bush. And of course, Hour of the Crab, the latest short story collection by Patricia Robertson. Thank you all so very much for taking the time to join us here tonight. I realize everybody's attention is always so fragmented with so many electronic options, so thank you for choosing us. And just a warm overall thank you to the three of you for such incredible insight and for taking the time to seriously and contemplatively answer all these questions and for the conversation. It's been a real joy, so thank you all.
Thanks, John.